Hi everyone, this is Dr. Nitin Choda, and in this video I'm going to answer the question, can you legally collect unemployment benefits if you refuse to go back to work or if you quit your job? I'm going to address three things in this video. The first is what is actually considered good cause, because the definition of good cause is very important for you to understand in this particular scenario. I'm going to answer the question, what is actually considered fraud, because that's something that is obviously going to get you into a lot of trouble. And number three, I'm going to talk about the state interpretations of eligibility for unemployment benefits. So here's the scoop for my subscribers. Workers can continue to collect unemployment benefits if there is good cause. Now, with this pandemic, ever since the CARES Act was passed back in March, the definition of good cause was expanded with the CARES Act. The definition included health, safety, or childcare reasons. So someone could technically quit or refuse to work and still get unemployment benefits if they had good cause. Again, that includes health, safety, and childcare reasons. Now, I have to point out that every state will make its own interpretation. So if you have questions, you need to contact your state agency, because at the end of the day, your state agency will decide whether your particular case qualifies for good cause. Now, keep in mind, this pandemic has been going in waves throughout the country. Some states are doing much better than others. I'll link you to an article below that walks you through the state of this pandemic across different regions across the country. For example, New York and New Jersey are doing much better now because they actually literally went through the worst period, whereas some other states, at the time I'm recording this video, I'm talking Texas, I'm talking Florida, are seeing a surge in cases. So depending on how bad the situation is in your state, depending on the number of cases in your state, that's how the state agency will then make, the state agencies will be overloaded and will then make the interpretations based on those things. Also, depending on the extent of recovery in your state, if the recovery is indeed getting better and better in your state, you will find that your state agency is less likely to be lenient. In other words, their definition of just cause is going to be very narrow. So if a state has a lot of applications, is completely overloaded with unemployment applications, you can expect them to be much more strict, to be much more narrow with the definition, with the acceptance of good cause, because then you're less likely to qualify for what's called as good cause. Again, the state will make this interpretation. So if your state is starting to open, if the number of cases have gone down, and let's hope that that starts to happen in your state, if the number of cases have gone down, if the state starts to reopen, if businesses start to reopen, if social distancing guidelines have been relaxed in your state, then it's going to be much harder for workers to be able to qualify for good cause. So if you live in a state that is reopening, that's starting to open back up, then it's going to be much harder for you to refuse work and then continue to qualify for unemployment benefits. Now, I know there aren't many jobs out there, but this is specifically intended to educate individuals who are refusing to go back to work or who are reconsidering going back to work because of safety reasons. Now, in short, there is no simple answer, and in general, if an individual refuses work or quits work, they are not eligible for unemployment benefits. But again, with the situation that we are in, with the CARES Act that was passed in March, the definition of good cause has been expanded. And again, this definition and this interpretation will be made by the state in which you live and will be made by your state agency, depending on your application, depending on the paperwork that you provide them, and depending on the reasons you provide them for seeking unemployment benefits. According to a recent article, Barry White, a spokesperson at California's Employment Development Department, and this department administers the unemployment benefits for workers in the state, he explained it in this manner. He said, good cause exists when a substantial motivating factor causing a resignation was real, substantial, and compelling, and would cause a reasonable person who genuinely wants to stay employed to quit under the same circumstances. So you may be eligible for good cause depending on your circumstances, depending on what you tell the state agency, and depending on the interpretation of the state agency. So here's an example. Let's say a worker has typical daytime hours, perhaps from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. and then has responsibilities afterwards, childcare responsibilities, let's say. If the employer demands a change in the work hours to nighttime hours from 4 p.m. to midnight, let's just say. In that situation, the worker would have good cause and should be able to quit and collect unemployment. But what if safety is a factor? Let's say you go to work, you don't find that everything is as clean as you want it to be. You're concerned about other individuals not wearing face masks. You're concerned about perhaps social distancing at work. What happens in situations where you feel unsafe? What if safety is a factor that's actually holding you back? Again, let me point out that this interpretation will be made by your state, but I can point you in the right direction. Unsafe working conditions can be a qualifying factor for good cause, and the worker has a duty to try to preserve the employer relationship. In other words, hash things out with their boss before quitting. That's what White said. So what's interesting here is if you have a problem, you are expected to, based on this information, to try and hash things out with your employer. In other words, you have to try and make an effort to work things out, and that is essentially what is expected from the worker. Now, the definition of good cause was significantly expanded with the CARES Act in March. It was expanded to include reasons related to the pandemic. Now, Michigan's Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity lists several qualifying reasons for good cause on its website. Some of these reasons include an individual in self-quarantine due to being immunocompromised, someone who has symptoms with the pandemic, someone who came in contact with someone in the last 14 days who tested positive or is required to care for someone who tested positive, someone who's unable to do their job temporarily due to the pandemic, due to medical complications, someone who has a family care responsibility without access to an alternative. In other words, childcare if schools or summer arrangements are closed. So states generally allow workers to satisfy good cause for these reasons during the pandemic. Also, if you feel unsafe or if your employer has not satisfied state and federal guidelines for safety, for sanitation with this pandemic, you could qualify for good cause and you could then qualify to collect unemployment benefits. But again, your state will make the final interpretation. I know I keep saying that over and over again because I do want you to go back to your state's website and get the final determination from your state. My goal is to point you in the right direction. Now, let's be clear. If your employer is keeping up with state and federal guidelines, if they're doing what they need to do, as I'm sure a lot of employers are in good faith, then you can't just say, hey, I don't feel safe, or let's say you have a general fear of the pandemic, or let's say you have a dislike for your job. That is not good cause. General fear of the pandemic or a dislike for your job is not a good cause for you to not go back to work and then continue to get unemployment. You could be denied for unemployment benefits, or you could potentially look at a recapture situation. I have done another training video on individuals being asked to repay their unemployment benefits. So this is something I do want you to be aware of because I don't want this to happen to any of my subscribers. Again, if your employer is doing what they're supposed to do, if your employer is fulfilling his or her obligations, their obligations to keep things safe at work, to mandate social distancing, to require face masks from individuals at work, then it'll be hard for you to turn down that job and then continue qualifying for unemployment benefits. And like I mentioned earlier, some states are going to be much more stricter in the interpretation, in the implementation of good cause compared to other states. For example, in Florida and North Carolina, about 11% of the unemployed workers are getting jobless benefits. So compared to New Jersey, which is paying unemployment benefits to half of their workers. Now you can imagine New Jersey to be much more strict in its interpretation of good cause as compared to, let's say, Florida and North Carolina based on most recent numbers. So again, your state will make the final interpretation. Your state will also be able to be either lenient or strict depending on the level of overload, depending on the status of applications, depending on the level of load on the entire system, the software system, the workers in the state agency. So it really comes down to your state at the end of the day. Now, if an individual quits or refuses work without good cause and then goes on to collect unemployment benefits, that is considered fraud according to the US Department of Labor. The worker would be ineligible for additional benefits, would have to repay back benefits received, and could be subject to criminal prosecution. Now, the truth is all the state agencies are completely overloaded. Their software systems, the number of staff processing the claims. I've had messages from subscribers who said they've been on the phone for hours. Some have emailed hundreds of times. Some have called thousands of times, and they have not been able to get to state agencies. So it's going to be hard for the state agencies to actually investigate cases of fraud. But as the pandemic eases, as things get better, you can bet that the state is going to go back and try and find individuals who tried to game the system. Now, there are three additional factors that we have to take into consideration. Number one, if someone refuses to go back to work, the employer actually has an incentive to notify the state that this individual refused to come back to work. The reason is there are state tax implications for the employer. So if you offer someone a job and they don't come back to work, then it has state tax implications for you as an employer, and so you will go ahead and notify the state. The second factor is the Paycheck Protection Program. Many businesses did get the Paycheck Protection Program, which requires that a certain percentage of the money that was received through the program should be spent on payroll. In other words, the employers are now motivated to offer their jobs back to workers so that workers come back, and so the employers can spend that money so that they can get a forgiveness of the Paycheck Protection Program. So there's a high possibility that your employer will want you to come back, and if you don't come back, then they are going to report that to the state. And finally, at the time that I'm recording this, the $600 per week federal unemployment booster is scheduled to end on the 31st of July. Now, it may be extended. This really depends on the information that we see coming out of the House and the Senate in the next few weeks. But assuming that those benefits end, the $600 per week federal booster, assuming that that unemployment benefit ends at the end of July, individuals are going to be incentivized, are going to actually be motivated to get back to work, simply because after the $600 federal booster, weekly booster is removed, the unemployment benefits are very little. In fact, they were designed to replace less than half of a person's normal wage. So with a very small amount of money coming in after the end of July, individuals would then need to go back to work in order to be able to supplement their income and pay their bills. As you can see, overall, this is a pretty complex subject. There are state level implications. There is the interpretation of just cause, and there is the concern about fraud. And again, like I said, states are very likely to go back and look at all their claims very closely to try and detect cases of fraud. I have done another training video on individuals that were asked to repay unemployment benefits, not necessarily due to fraud, but due to oversight, due to mistakes, due to technical reasons that happen on the part of the state because the state agencies are overloaded. This is something you need to know. If you satisfy the conditions for good cause, you may be able to continue getting unemployment benefits. Make sure you check with your state. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you learned something new. If you did, please consider clicking the like button. Please click the subscribe button so you get instant updates from me going forward. And also please click notifications so you get instantly notified. Thank you so much. I'll see you in the next training. Take care.